on the policies. So it focused on the policy formulations and design issues, and the discussion were organized as a series of panel discussions, involving mostly the ministers, from all Pacific Island countries, and then moderators, of course, and then Q&A after that. The Prime Minister of Fiji opened the conference, provided the keynote address, and then also the senior officials, the vice presidents of JICA and also ADB Director General also participated in closing the sessions. About 120 participants, Ministry of Finance, Permanent Secretaries, Central Bank Governors, workshop participants, and all development partners. It's a big event. So there are three panels. The first one focuses on the investment, in the disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. The second one is on the public finance management and the debt sustainability. The third one is on the financing side. What are the options and what are the obstacles in terms of the climate change financing? Let me move quickly on the takeaways. Let me focus on the first one, the high-level dialogue, the first panel, which is on the investment in disaster risk reduction. The first one is that the building resilience to natural disaster is also important for sustaining growth. There was some discussion, should there be a trade-off between growth and building fiscal buffer, for example? And the answer is no, because by improving the resilience, the countries can prevent the dip, prevent the contractions of the economic growth during the disaster. And by doing that, the economic resilience would improve. So it's not necessarily a trade-off. 1 minute? Wow, okay. Okay, then, the second one is on the, I will just read them. The long run focus on the building resilience, the focus is on long run building resilience, but in the immediate aftermath, there is always a trade-off between which sectors or which priorities needs to be focused on. And that's the issue that the policymakers have to deal with. And there is also a difficult to build hardcore resilience in the Pacific because there is a trade-off between a social, need, social spending on education and health versus the infrastructure development. So there's always a difficult balance that we need to maintain. And finally, partnering with the private sector is important because low insurance coverage in the Pacific Island countries, then the government will have to rely on the private sector. So that is something that was the key takeaways of the first panel. Okay. The organizer will have my presentation, so you can walk through. And the second one is the public financial PFM and the debt sustainability. The first one is that the external funded project tend to set a high standard in linking the building resilience. And as a result, project implementation is always, well, not always, but it's often it's a challenge because, institutional capacity. And then the second one is that the building economic resilience and ensuring debt sustainability are complementary. Again, it's not a trade-off. And the DSA framework that is currently being done by the IMF and the World Bank is still being revised to review to incorporate national disasters. And then any project financed the government assistance must be country-born, country-led, and implemented using the country systems. And the availability of in-country funding is also important. And then finally, the Pacific Islands should explore alternative instruments, such as buffers on contingent credit line, like facilities from development partners. And in managing the PFM and fiscal buffers, countries should continue what kind of priorities and what kind of hazard or risks, highest risk that they have to address. Finally, this is my final slides on the panel 3. The first one is that securing climate change financing is a challenge for the Pacific Island countries because of the capacity constraint, and that's why climate change financing needs to be less bureaucratic. The domestic resource mobilization is also important. You know. Without domestic financing, it will be harder to access external financings. And country authorities need to build ownerships to keep the development partners involved. So the country authorities needs to be the driver. Partnership with the civil society has also been useful. And working together as a region, you know, through a well-coordinated approach is also go a long way in improving resilience. And finally, you know, it's important to look at the ex-ante implication of project financing. In this context, you know, if I have to mention one important point in terms of this climate change resilience, is basically improving the PFM and the multi medium-term budget framework, multi-year budget framework. Those are the main key to, you know, if I have to say one important thing from the outcome is that PFM and the multi-year budget framework. And this is just the photos from the high-level conference. We had about 140, 130 people came, and it was a huge event. Thank you. Sorry, running a little bit late.
Thank you very much, and please round of applause for Tobagus. I think it was quite a challenge, 15 minutes to put into context the macroeconomic policies, especially fiscal responses. I would now like to introduce our next speaker. David brings to the region 16 years of experience in engineering design and project management, especially large-scale transport infrastructure projects. He's currently based in the ADB office in Suva, and I give the floor to David. Remember the time management.
Okay, yes, thanks, Chair. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this afternoon, and thank you to the event organisers to have me. I feel very honoured to be able to rub shoulders with the intellect that this forum attracts, and I hope I leave you as enthusiastic with this study as I am myself. For the PRIF, for those who are not familiar, this initiative started in 2009. The purpose is to improve the quality of infrastructure in our Pacific Island countries. It does this by coordinating development partners, providing technical assistance, and by coordinating and directing research. PRIF has 7 donors, and as such represents most of the major development partners who are active in our region. PRIF working sector groups are made up of staff, technical staff from each of our partner institutions. They meet 3 to 4 times a year to discuss project opportunities, project pipelines, and to identify the best practices and how they can be utilised and adapted for application in the Pacific. In 2015, the Transport Sector Working Group gathered, and there was a long and considered discussion on coastal protection. I think it was the World Bank who actually came to the table and said, you know, there's a great opportunity. We have been doing much work in the Pacific, and we have really need to step up and improve our performance with regard to coastal protection. So they launched this study. The question is why? There's 2 important answers to that. Obviously, the land and sea interface is where much valuable road, maritime and air infrastructure exists, and where we lose shoreline materials and where that intersects with this infrastructure, our countries are suffering significant economic costs. So at the front end of the design process, we need to make sure that we take all of this into consideration and design accordingly. Now, there's also a political element here. Dame Meg Taylor this morning mentioned fragile countries. She brought up the concept that there's a definition change happening internationally. Previously, it has been about post-conflict states. Now, there's more recognition that climate susceptibility and vulnerability to the risks borne by climate change are bringing into the market, the funding market, greater funding opportunities. So, for me, in that context of Dame Meg's observation, I thought before I talk about the study, I would talk about what has been done on coastal protection so far. The UNDP, not a member of PRIF, unfortunately, they are leading this charge. They have embraced the susceptibility argument, and they put a very convincing proposal to the Green Climate Fund and secured $39 million of grant money for a project in Tuvalu. Now, this is a staggering amount of money for such a small country, but that shows the power of the political shift, and it really illustrates why I've been invited to come and talk today, because there is an opportunity for all the Pacific countries to take part in this, to promote your country's needs and to make sure that you get your share of the funding pie that is being made available. Sorry, I must go back. I've forgotten to mention what the other development partners have done. World Bank are looking to implement a project in Marshall Islands on coastal protection. The Asian Development Bank are implementing a climate resilience sector project in Tonga. And with this continued focus and also the success enjoyed by the UNDP, they are also positioning Tonga to apply for another $60 million grant at the end of this year for a very significant project in Tongatapu. So onto the study, why I've been invited to talk. Okay, so there are a range of measures that can be used to mitigate erosion. The most attractive, of course, is to avoid the need altogether. Don't build roads, don't build your house, don't build valuable infrastructure on the coast. Unfortunately, where land availability is limited and there are existing structures in play, obviously we must protect those. In that challenge, there's obviously a few other obstacles. Our countries in the Pacific don't all have good materials. There's only a few that have got good quality quarries from which we extract materials, mostly for roads. But these are also called upon to provide rock material for sea armour walls and the like. So unfortunately, most of our countries don't have them, and then for those that don't, the costs of importing them are prohibitive. So it was in this context that this study commenced. Okay, so non-engineered solutions have been trialled in this region for many years with various success. They've included gabion baskets, sand cement bags, stacked coral rock, cemented coral rock, concrete filled barrels and pipes, and other materials of opportunity. When you're trying to protect your valuable structure and your livelihood, you embrace whatever materials you can get your hands on. Across the Pacific Island countries, we know that materials consistent with the existing design guidelines are not available, and it is in this light that the scope for an innovative use of locally available materials exists, and this, of course, is the focus of this study. So, to the objectives, there's been plenty done, so we just needed to collate and build on existing knowledge. We wanted to find erosion protection solutions that maximise the use of local materials and labour, and of course to minimise the prohibitive costs of imported materials and equipment. So the study involved 3 phases. Throughout the 3 phases, the study identified the countries with material supply problems. It catalogued existing non-engineered solutions. It critically evaluated these approaches using a multi-criteria analysis, and it provided recommendations for the improvement of existing structures. So, importantly, preferred solutions were based upon modelling, and there was field testing to verify these findings. So I won't read to you long lengths on this multi-criteria analysis, but there was 3 points. The technical criteria considered primarily cost and effectiveness to protect, and then this was blended with other social and environmental criteria. Note please that this first phase provided indicative costing for coastal protection solutions, and it provides, the novice designer a very valuable tool to consider a particular site and to better understand the likely costs and the likely performance differences between the different solutions. So, to test the adequacy of our study, the University of New South Wales conducted some hydraulic testing. You'll see here, this is a 1:7.5 scale model. The one on the left tested geotextile baskets, a very heavily woven synthetic fabric. It's very durable. And then the other, on the right-hand side, is concrete block work, the typical type of concrete blocks that would be used in housing construction. Sorry, I've lost my place here. So here we come. This is the golden offering of this particular study. This design guidance manual provides the reader with due diligence strategies to investigate the needs and to address the requirements that need to be designed to. So a draft of this manual will be presented on a webinar on Monday next week at 12 o'clock Suva time. If you would like to be involved in this webinar, please tell me. I will send you the link details. I would encourage anybody involved in coastal protection to actually become involved with this. The great value, of course, is the costing information, the standard design drawings, and importantly, lots and lots of terms of reference with regard to how to do set-outs and survey each individual scene. So the content of this report will be finalised by the 30th of June, and this will also be on the Proof website by early August. So stage 3 involves a field verification pilot. They will take the design manual and they will test 100 metre sections. They will probably use, most likely, the concrete blocks We're looking to the World Bank to provide us an entry on Marshall Islands. We're also looking to the Asian Development Bank to have a discussion with the Tonga government for a test pilot on northeast Tongatapu. Once we actually implement these projects, the PRIF will provide plenty of support thereafter on a monitoring and evaluation, and it will all be about dissemination thereafter. So today I'm here to ask you to help me to disseminate this. This is valuable intellectual offering, and with more knowledge and more dissemination, obviously, the efforts that have been put to date will deliver even greater benefits. So it's at this stage that I will be a little bit naughty. A few days ago, I was approached by some friends of mine from JICA. I'll ask Oba-san to put his hand up now. Okay. Oba-san will be at the back of the auditorium when this session finishes. To this very narrow focus of coastal protection that the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and most other development partners focus on, there are also other projects that look to the social elements and really focus on the beach and the protection of the beach in the context of important cultural factors and the projects as a tool for the mobilisation of people. In Tuvalu, sorry Oba-san, I've got the wrong... Look, let me tell you, this project that JICA are putting together in Tuvalu, there is a 200-metre long beach. The width of the beach is about 25 metres. At two ends, there's two groins, 100 metres long. I had a wonderful photo here that I don't have now. The beach is a real focal point for the community, and JICA have done a fantastic effort in developing this project. They will be presenting a guideline, a design guideline in December 2017, and in the absence of the overhead material, I would encourage all people to collect a small handout at the door on your departure. So look, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and I'll see you over the next 2 days.
Thank you very much, David. And it's good to hear that though there's some trials on engineering coastal protection, there's also a look at the opportunities to look at social and cultural factors towards how to protect our coastline. I now turn to the next speaker, who is Scott from the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. Scott is the Economic Infrastructure Advisor, and he works on infrastructure policy and improving access to climate change finance for the Pacific Island countries. And I give Scott the floor.
Thanks very much, Tia, and thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and to my esteemed panel colleagues as well. And I'd like to be able to thank the organisers and the sponsors of this meeting for the opportunity to be invited here and to speak this afternoon. So as Tia said, in terms of our focus here, I'm looking at the framework for resilient development in the Pacific, which is a new strategy which has just recently been endorsed by leaders. I guess before I start my discussion about the presentation, the decision by leaders and the details of the FRDP, I just wanted to, I guess, highlight the importance of the meeting last year in Ponape, where the forum leaders reaffirmed that climate change and disaster risk management will remain a top priority for the region, not only for this year and next year, but most highly likely into the medium term. This is important as we are dealing with the challenges of a full agenda for leaders and for member countries. And this has obviously been increasingly being filled with a range of diverse political, social and economic challenges that we face. And obviously we can see that from the agenda that we have at this very important meeting. If there is one key message from the FRDP, it's about the need to be able to build resilience for the Pacific and the need to incorporate climate change and disaster risk management into the development discourse. So this has been a long journey, and I know that there have been many national and regional champions of this work in the Pacific. I know I can only express my personal enthusiasm and support for this, that we're now able to go past the policy work and now start progress towards the implementation. So overall, 2015 and 2016 have been very critical years for multilateralism. It was a very successful demonstration that nations can work together in terms of the outcomes if we look towards the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and also, of course, the Paris Agreement. And also should mention the Samoa Pathway as well. In line with these developments, leaders in 2016 endorsed the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific and recognised its potential to support coordination and action on a number of key issues related to supporting national implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, in addition to their low carbon development pathways identified often through their nationally determined contributions. Leaders also agreed to the Pohnpei Statement for strengthening Pacific resilience to climate change and disaster risks, although I won't bore you with the details of that, but it does complement the FRDP, and it is part of the Leaders' Declaration that was made last year. The main thing with regard to the Leaders' decision was that they tasked the Forum Secretariat to convene a working group to elaborate on the Pacific Resilience Partnership process, which is meant to be able to support the implementation of the FRDP. So in terms of the leaders' specific decision, they endorsed the Framework for Resilient Development. They agreed for it to be fully elaborated and operationalised upon the entry into force in Paris, which occurred on the 5th of October and then came into operation on the 5th of November, and recognised its potential to support coordination and action in a number of key issues related to climate change and disaster risk management. So we should not underplay what means or ignore the role that the Pacific has played, obviously, with regard to not only the early ratification of the Paris Agreement, but also the fact is that when we look in the wider scale of things, it did take the Kyoto Protocol 8 years to be able to get enough countries and enough proportion of emissions to be able to basically get over the line to come into force. So what does the FRDP replace? The framework we're discussing today did start out with a vision, and it is satisfying to become the reality. In 2012, the Pacific Island Forum leaders again decided that they wanted to support the development of a single integrated regional strategy on climate change and disaster risk management to succeed the previous two separate strategy frameworks. So these are the Pacific Islands Framework for Action on Climate Change and the Pacific Disaster Management Framework for Action. And so unfortunately we have a little movement where they come together, and so we can move on to that. Now, the substantive work on the formulation of the new strategy was initiated after the first joint meeting of the Pacific Climate Change Roundtable and Pacific Platform Disaster Risk Management, and that took place in 2013. The development of the strategy was led by a steering committee that was supported by a technical working group. That steering committee had representatives from member countries, from non-state actors, from the private sector, and as I said, supported by a group that was a technical working group consisting of representatives from the SPC, SPREP, USP, UNISDR, UNDP, and the Forum Secretariat. So the development of the FRDP also occurred over several years and was made possible through the provision of funding support, in particular from the European Union, the Australian Government, the Government of Sweden, the Government of Japan, and United States Agency for International Development, USAID. So I'd like to be able to thank their support for that. So what is the FRDP in terms of what it's meant to do? Sorry for that. So what is the FRDP? When we speak of resilience and supporting sustainable development, there are some important points to understand about the FRDP. The FRDP is a voluntary set of guidelines. It's a regional framework that supports the implementation of national strategies and plans but does not replace them. It is a non-political policy document, and it's non-prescriptive in terms of regarding the position that countries might take at international negotiations. And finally, it's a living document. That means that it will be regularly revised to incorporate the needs of Pacific Island countries and territories. The FRDP provides coordinated and integrated priorities for the regional, national, community levels that is embedded in sustainable development, leading to resilient development outcomes. Climate change, as I said, and disaster risk management, as I stated before, are no longer specific sector challenges, but a core part of the development planning discourse that we need to be a part of. In terms of the specific vision of the FRDP, we see that it has a vision that aspires for the Pacific people, societies, economies, culture, and natural environments to be resilient to changing conditions and extreme events resulting from climate change, climate variability, geological processes to enhance the well-being of our people to promote sustainable development. There are 3 goals within the FRDP. The first one is strengthen integrated adaptation and risk reduction to enhance resilience to climate change. This is about managing risks and improving the efficiency of resource management. The second, dealing with low carbon development, is about reducing carbon intensity, the efficiency of energy consumption, the efficient use of energy resources, and also the resilience of energy infrastructure. Finally, the last one is dealing with strengthened disaster preparedness, response and recovery, and that deals with the preparation and the improving the efficiency of preparation, but also in terms of being able to improve the rapidness of support and response. So the key messages of the FRDP basically mean that the overall message of the FRDP is to enhance resilience to climate change and disasters in ways that contribute to and are embedded in sustainable development. The framework is not just providing direction to climate change and disaster communities, projects or programs. Rather, it presents a holistic guidance about ensuring that the actions we take are also embedded in sustainable development and poverty alleviation. And just as a quick aside, last week I was actually presenting the framework to the PRIF Management Committee last week. And this is part of the wider process of advocacy related to the FRDP. So the FRDP advocates 2 types of integration. First of all, integrated actions to address climate change and disasters wherever possible. There is a large overlap, not complete, but there is a large overlap amongst the areas. So this guidance recognises that overlap between them and looks at the similar tools used for resources required to monitor, analyse, address climate and disaster risks. Many Pacific Island countries and territories have already taken concrete steps to manage these risks in an integrated manner. So the FRDP is not leading the way, it's basically coming from a regional level in terms of supporting existing work already happening in many countries in the region. Secondly, in terms of the FRDP advocates more effective mainstreaming of actions to address climate change and disaster risks into development planning, including policy making, planning, financing, programming and implementation. This is action around a particular range of areas which is identified in the publication itself. Because climate change and disaster risks are cross-cutting, and so action must take place at the sectoral level and across a range of different areas normally considered outside of disaster risk and climate change. It's essential that mainstream actions build resilience into development sectors such as health, education, water, sanitation, agriculture, and David in his previous presentation I highlighted an important one with regard to coastal infrastructure. The FRDP takes an all-stakeholder approach to building resilience as everyone's business. It's not just resting with particular development partners, it's not resting with countries, it's not resting with regional organisations, it's resting with all of us to be able to work together and cooperatively on this issue. The FRDP also advocates a human rights approach in all actions to build resilience. A guiding principle of the framework ensures that protection of human rights such as right to life, safety, dignity, non-discrimination, and access to basic necessities so that every person has equitable access to humanitarian development assistance according to his or her specific needs. The FRDP also aims for a systematic adoption of inclusive and participative processes which should not only gather contributions across different stakeholder groups, but also ensure that the most vulnerable are considered as key stakeholders to be able to participate in all actions as actors for building resilience. National and regional resilience starts with empowering all persons within communities to respond to disasters and climate change, including those that are most vulnerable, for example, women, children, older persons, and persons with physical and mental disabilities. The FRDP provides guidance to small island developing states that need to be supported in building resilience to natural hazards and the effects of climate change, particularly through finance, technology transfer and capacity building from developed countries and development partners tailored to their needs and priorities as identified by them. Important and ongoing future work on loss and damage, the importance of dealing with human displacement caused by climate change, and the further development of disaster risk insurance for the Pacific are all included in the document and identified as priorities. The framework is also closely aligned to implementing the global agreements such as the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, the Samoa Pathway, Sustainable Development Agenda, and the World Humanitarian Summit as part of this work going forward. And it aims not to duplicate the work for countries, but aims to be able to utilise those existing reporting mechanisms that have been utilised. Last week there was a major conference on the SDGs and the measurement and assessment of those SDGs going forward. And that's part of the process where we're working very closely to ensure that we don't duplicate nor provide additional burden to our member countries. To implement the process going forward, there's a proposal to create what's known as the Pacific Resilience Partnership as a regional governance structure to support the implementation of the FRDP. This will facilitate different stakeholder groups, communities of practice working on climate change, disaster risk, sustainable development, finance, planning, etc., such as and low carbon development to work together, share experiences, but also promote better regional coordination, support the implementation of the FRDP through and improve monitoring coordinations and also communications and also regional meetings. The group has met twice this year. The first meeting was in early February, the second meeting was in May, and basically the group consisting of a wide variety of countries, crop organisations and stakeholders has come up with a series of key features for the Pacific Resilience Partnership. And they include aspects of inclusiveness and human rights approach, the creation of a task force to be action-oriented and results-based, inclusive representation on the PRP task force, clear definition of what paradigm shift and Pacific leadership means, emphasis on strong ownership by countries and territories with the support of all stakeholders progressing the resilience agenda. The Pacific supported by a technical working group that are time-bound and results-based in key areas that are identified by the task force or the Pacific Resilience Meeting, and a support unit operation that will be anchored in the free crop agencies with support drawn from other stakeholders. This is just a diagrammatic presentation. I thought after all that writing you deserve something in terms of to rest the eyes. But basically, each of the four groups identified in the FRDP, private sector, community and civil society, national, subnational governments, regional organisations and development partners come together through the Pacific Resilience Meeting. The Pacific Resilience Task Force provides the means to be able to provide the implementation going forward and then to feed up to the Pacific leaders for the various meetings such as not only the Pacific Forum Leaders Meeting but also the CRGA, SPREP Council and also other associated ministerial meetings of relevance. Just lastly, with regard to going forward for this process, now that we've had this process that was requested by leaders in terms of having a Pacific Resilience Partnership Working Group, we now have a series of a proposed governance arrangement going forward, and that's been finalised in conjunction with country and stakeholder comments. A paper will be going to my governing council for the Forum Secretariat, which is the Forum Officials Committee, where that will be considered in August. And if that is endorsed by the FOC, then it will go through to the leaders for their consideration and approval when they meet in September. We also have a paper going through to the SPC CRGA, which will be considered in July, and the SPREP Governing Council will meet in September. And as I said, we'll be seeking forum leaders' approval of that governance arrangements going forward. So again, I'd like to be able to thank you for your time. I hope that I've got us back on track for the timing so that my last presenter has some time to speak, and I look forward to any comments or questions you might have. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon.
Thank you, Scott, on presenting on a framework that integrates climate change and disaster risk into sustainable development for the Pacific. And I now move on to our next speaker, Kaya. Kaya is a practicing barrister. She attained her BA in Pacific Studies in Environmental Law from the University of Auckland, and her passion and specialization lies in environmental and climate change law, especially in respect to the Pacific. I give the floor to Kaya.
Nisa Bulavanaka, good afternoon to all of you here today, my fellow panelists, esteemed guests, our moderator, and colleagues. I'd like to thank the ADB, ANU, and USP for the opportunity to present this paper here today. So far you've heard from the economists and one engineer, so now you're going to have to hear from the lawyer. As you guys have been told, my name is Kaya. I'm a practicing barrister here in Suva at Lal Patel Bale Lawyers. And I'm really hoping that my title was relatively self-explanatory. So climate change has been overwhelmingly accepted by science and academics and the world as being real. And however ubiquitous this phenomenon may be, for the most part, the discourse has overwhelmingly been in respect to people who would be displaced by climate change, what is colloquially and often wrongly referred to as climate change refugees. So we know theoretically what happens to the people, but what happens to their land and ocean territories that they came from? So these days, especially in Fiji, it is very difficult to even walk out your front door without being bombarded by climate change rhetoric or information about COP23. And for our purposes, or for my purposes rather, the impacts of climate change and climate change-induced sea level rise fall within two categories: the long-term effects and the short-term effects, essentially. So long-term, we see the potential possibility that whole or parts of Pacific Islands may vanish, may sink. You know, this is the rhetoric that the media is portraying basically hysterically, predominantly due to inundation and excessive sea level rise. However, more concerningly for us would be the short-term effects. Climate change-induced sea level rise has the potential to render islands uninhabitable, which this is what poses the threat to Pacific Island sovereignty, to statehood, and to exclusive economic zones. As sea levels rise, they in turn cause greater coastal erosion and greater inundation, which subsequently results in a greater chance that the thin freshwater lenses on these islands are likely to be contaminated by saltwater. And as this happens, this will either destroy or contaminate the water sources, and in some cases destroy the ability for islands to grow crops, whether for feed or for livestock. And once an island can no longer produce its own food or water, it essentially poses the threat of becoming uninhabitable. And in the Pacific, where along our coast we see the area of concentration of populations and infrastructure and resources, this short-term effect is probably an even bigger and more imminent threat than the long-term for us. So, (1982). A coastal state may claim from their baseline a territorial sea, an exclusive economic zone to 200 nautical miles, and then in the cases of some lucky state, or needed to meet this territorial requirement. And so there is the possibility that if some land remained, then we could still possibly generate or a claim to certain areas of ocean territory. However, in its worst case scenario, if nothing remained, this is where we're seeing some of the questions arise. Because there is an increasing push within the legal literature to encourage this territorial requirement to be a flexible one. So in the cases of governments in exiles, you would only need to have a territorial base of operations, somewhere to operate from, and this did not necessarily have to be within your own borders. And so the final two criteria, a government and the ability to enter into relations with other states, are often deemed to be the most flexible requirements out of the four. And it's pretty straightforward why this is. It's because over the centuries that a state has been considered a body in law, numerous states have failed at various points in time to either meet the government portion or to meet the retention, or fail to have the ability to enter into relations with other states. So for example, PNG, the Solomon Islands and Fiji, at any given point when they had a crisis, never ceased to be a state for the lack of an effective government. So under our current international framework then, putting this against one another, what does this actually mean? So if we were to take a strict legal reading then, then the Pacific Islands run the risk essentially of becoming reduced to what is described in law as rocks. This is because under Article 121 of UNCLOS, an island needs to be a naturally formed piece of land, which is above the water at high tide. And this piece of land then subsequently allows this generation of exclusive economic zones. If an island was reduced to a rock, then this reduces their claimable area from 15,500 square nautical miles to 452,000 square nautical miles. So this is a big difference for us. And the worst case scenario, submergence. In this situation, it's pretty clear. Islands are completely inundated or they sink because of sea level rise. If this is the case, they would be, under the current international legal framework, there is no claim. This area of land that was once Fiji or Tonga or Samoa, Tuvalu or Tokelau would then revert to being the high seas with no one having a claim for it and it being governed by international law. So the other options that we have are potentially conserving sovereignty through the inclusion of lighthouses or artificial conservation. So some have suggested within the literature building lighthouses on sinking islands essentially as a sovereignty marker. While theoretically this is really sounds great and there is precedence for it within the law, the issue is that under UNCLOS Article 60, these artificial conservations might be deemed exactly what they are, artificial conservations, and artificial installations cannot warrant the protection or creation of an exclusive economic zone and has no claimable area. So after this, we come to the possibility of baselines and boundaries and what we can do within them. So the first one would be to freeze baselines. So some have been pushing for the idea of freezing or fixing our current baselines where we have them currently. The only issue with this model to protect sovereignty would be, do we freeze our baselines from the inception of UNCLOS, from today, from 10 years from now? And it raises a very complicated interplay of law on how to actually do this. The fifth option is the doctrine of historic waters. And so this is a doctrine within law that countries could possibly evoke to say that the area of land that the area of sea, that they have claimed stays with them. And in order to do this, they have to show that a country has had and maintained jurisdiction over this area of water, and that other countries agree to their claims. So for Pacific Islands, the issue here lies with showing that you have had an undisturbed possession of this water, considering how large our ocean areas are. And I was going to discuss masterly inactivity, but because I'm running far over time, I'm going to skim over it. Basically, masterly inactivity means you deposit your boundaries with the UNCLOS body or with the UN, and then you leave it and you do nothing. So inactivity is the emphasis there. So then basically, what are our options then under UNCLOS? So there is one untried version or option to take to retain boundaries and possession of claimable sea areas, where basically a country can propose a specific amendment to UNCLOS as a whole through a written communication to the UN Secretary General. However, this requires a 12-month process and half, which is 84 countries, to agree favorably to this specific amendment. The other option is through a simplified procedure where instead of convening a conference through a written communication, which you would do under the first option, you basically circulate your documents, and if one country says they don't like it, it's dead. That's it. So numerically, these pose quite challenging odds for us to actually be successful in do. So the other option is moving to a decision of the meeting of the parties of the Law of the Sea Convention, also rather cutely referred to as a SPLOS. And so this has been used before to amend UNCLOS. However, each time it was used to postpone elections or change submission times. It was purely procedural and never anything substantive, like including climate change in an already established legal regime. And so the third option is potentially using an agreement supplementary to UNCLOS. And so basically, these are agreements that aim at supplementing interpretation and implementation of UNCLOS and can be adopted and negotiated in various forms. This has only been done once, but it was successful. But once again, it was a procedural, textural changes, including new voting procedures. It was not a process of substantive body changes within the document. So finally, and very quickly, I know I've been time is quite tight here. Our other options are for, sovereignty, retention of sovereignty, retention of claimable areas for Pacific Islands within a world of a changing climate and rising sea levels, would be for the creation of a customary regional international law. And so this is basically a subsection of international law where a group of countries or basically get together and say that, yes, they agree that this is a custom. This is something that they've always done and they're continuing to do it. And one way to really build on this or to get it across the line would be for not only Pacific Island large ocean states, but for also large ocean states in the Caribbean or in the Indian Ocean to also say that, yes, these are our oceans and it's never changed, and help by abiding this creation of custom. And customary international law, regional international law, has shown great strength at being accepted within the international legal regime under both the International Law of the Sea Tribunal as well as the International Court of Justice. And in order to meet this, a country would basically just have to say that it is state practice and that they believe that their actions amount to law. So it's actually comparatively a very straightforward process, I personally think. Traditionally, though, it's been quite a slow process until now. We're seeing this greater acceptance by the international community to allow for the acceptance of a rapidly evolving customary regional international law, which for the Pacific is very good. It's a very good thing for climate change and a very good possibility for us for retaining these areas. The other one is judicialization, taking it to the courts, the International Tribunal on Law of the Sea, and getting them to decide, getting them to give us the answers for the spaces and the silences within the document. And finally, a new treaty. We could decide that we're going to create a whole new legal regime for dealing with climate change, induced sea level rise, and its impacts on boundaries. This could be a brand new treaty, or it could be something for UNCLOS or the UNFCCC. So very finally, like in the last 10 seconds, what is certain though, what is clear is that UNCLOS and our current system is very badly equipped to deal with this current problem, especially for Pacific states. And so it's clear that the Pacific Islands are facing a double harm prospect, where climate change will threaten or push us to lose our lands, and international law will threaten or completely remove our seas. So the question remains is, what option do we take and where do we go from here? Thank you.
Thank you, Kaya, and that's very enlightening understanding that our sovereignty at times is also based on international laws that we have to work to address and try to influence. You've been presented with 4 different aspects of climate change adaptation and resilience. I think it provides quite a good dialogue. And I now open the floor for questions, clarifications, or feedback from the audience. And you don't have to put up your hands all in one go. Oh, there's a question at the center there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. Aileen Power, I'm an independent researcher. Kaya, my question is actually around, given what's happening in the South China Sea and decisions around sovereignty and water, are there things we can learn in the Pacific around the reasons for those decisions being made?
So thank you, Hannah, for that question. I'm just going to, apologize for how rushed that presentation might have seemed, trying to cram 50 years to 100 years of international law into 15 minutes, especially when you're framing it against climate change, is always a challenge. The South China Sea actually is a very interesting case study. So for those of you who aren't aware, basically there's been some contention over how far sea boundaries extend basically between China and I think Japan, if I'm not mistaken, into the South China Sea. And basically China has attempted to shore up or demonstrate their claim by building artificial islands. And so what's very interesting is that under Article 60 of UNCLOS, artificial islands can be built within a country's exclusive economic zone, but they cannot generate their own claimable land territories. So for example, your furthest point on your map of an island essentially, is where you would start measuring your exclusive economic zone or your territorial claims from. So you can, within your own area, build an artificial island and it's fine. But if you build it on the edge of your boundary and attempts to push out your exclusive economic zone, it doesn't work that way. And so with the South China Sea, what's very interesting is that previously, America had actually come out very openly and said that they denied China's claim through the use of artificial islands. But since the new Trump administration has come in, they've actually backtracked on that and is now supporting China's claim as a way to shore up an allyship over North Korea. So politically, this is quite interesting. Before, the United States, one of the largest bodies, was very adamant that artificial island zoning was not a thing that could be accepted to produce an exclusive economic zone. However, with their backtracking now and them openly coming out and saying yes, it could provide an interesting stepping stone or a wormhole to slowly start digging at the issue to increase the recognition of artificial islands, which for the Pacific, I know a number of islands have said that they were considering this. I think Tahiti recently was saying that they were considering it, and I think there have been some talk with some of the other islands about using artificial islands as a means of conservation. So for us, it's actually a very good thing in the sense that it might allow our claims and the use of artificial means to get more gravitas, to be more realized.
One question from the gentleman at the center.
Thank you. The question is actually for probably one of you who can just respond. On the stand by the United States too on the Trump administration, and where will we, the Pacific, go to if a super nation who we look up to suddenly decides to look, we're not interested in this? How do we manage that? How do we mitigate that from small island economies? We know the issue with climate change. Perhaps the Americans don't. Then how do we deal with that? It's quite a worrying thing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll allow the panelists to give their response. It might be their own personal views and on that, and I'll give it from the start from Tobagas all the way down to Kai. Thank you.
I think, you know, regardless of what happened in the global development in terms of the climate change, the small islands in the Pacific will remain vulnerable to natural disasters anyway. So I think building economic resilience will still very important regardless of what happened in the world. So if let's say there is a cyclone coming in to one of the small islands in the Pacific, that will affect growth, that will affect on the fiscal, so the government will have to prepare. So again, my point is that preparing and building economic resilience, developing policies in which the country can have a good strategy in not only in reducing the impact or mitigating the negative impact of natural disasters in the short term, and also building more resilient economy in the longer term is always still relevant. So I think, and that point is something that we need to work on together, both the authorities and the development partners in developing the policies to build economic resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. The question sort of emphasises the significance of the US as a national and international player in the climate change discussion. I think we need to remember that the US is just one country. In all of these international treaties, we have many countries in the Pacific that are getting up and sharing their voice. If you're concerned about what this administration may or may not do with regard to their historic commitments with climate change, the US government under the previous administration has already given $1 billion to the Green Climate Fund. And the current administration has stood up and confirmed that they will continue with their current projects. So it might be a short-term absence from a leadership position, but in the future this will likely change, as with all democratic governments, and I think that countries like Fiji are proud, they're strong, they get up on the world and international stage, and they promote their self-interests. And for me, I don't see there being a need for great concern.
Thanks very much for your question. I mean, I guess the thing is that obviously it's easy to be able to look at the decision with alarm, but I think the first point was when the United States President did make that announcement just over 3 weeks ago now, the specific details of what the US position was going to be in terms of its engagement with the Paris Agreement and what it was going to withdraw from is still quite vague. And so we're awaiting more details with regard to what the specific US position will be as it goes forward, to enable us to be able to understand completely. Obviously, there was also an offer with regard to the US, obviously being interested in engaging in a new agreement. However, being part of the Paris Agreement and the negotiations for that, it was very hard as it was to be able to do that. But anyway, I think that's one aspect with regard to the fact is that we need to be able to wait for more clarification from the US, particularly the US State Department. I know that for the recent negotiations sessions that occurred in Bonn in May, was that the US delegation didn't have clear instructions from their government. And so hopefully coming into the negotiations that will come as part of COP23 in Bonn in November, they'll have clearer instructions about how they're going to go forward. I guess the other thing too is that to look on the upside was that the US did not withdraw from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's very important because that means that if the US had withdrawn from that, then basically they would have withdrawn from the whole framework that has been pushing the whole process on negotiating not only the Paris Agreement but the Kyoto Protocol, etc., and other work going forward. The other thing too is that the US provides 22% of the budget of the UNFCCC Secretariat. So again, by the US not withdrawing from UNFCCC, that indicates the US still remains engaged in the negotiations process as it goes forward. The other thing too is that obviously we need to be able to ensure that there is engagement. This is a global process, and as I said in my presentation, multilateralism had a series of important successes in 2014, 2015, 2016, particularly not only with the Paris Agreement, but also with the Sendai Framework, and also with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. This is not just purely about climate change, this is about development in general. The fact is that climate change, climate variability, disaster or natural hazards are cross-cutting, going across a range of sectors, providing development challenges for countries, rather than it means that it requires a holistic approach by all countries. The other thing too is that, as David already identified, US is funding, the United States government is already funding a series of climate change funding programs in the Pacific, most notably the US READY program and the ISAC program. These are ongoing and continue to indicate the US is engaged and continuing its involvement in the Pacific on climate change, particularly climate change finance, but climate change issues overall. The last matter is that the Pacific governments responded very quickly. Most leaders were in New York or heading to New York when that announcement was made, and as a consequence, the president of the Federated States of Micronesia, who's currently the forum chair, he made a press release statement, fairly strong statement about the importance of the United States remaining engaged and identifying the priority that climate change has for Pacific Island countries in the Pacific. And as I said in the presentation, it is one of the key priority areas within the Pacific and will remain so as we go forward. So again, I think the fact is that rather than seeing this as an immediate setback, it is a challenge, but it's something that we need to keep engaged with the United States and seeing the glasses half full rather than half empty when we're looking at the challenge as we seek to be able to ensure that the United States remains engaged on climate change. Thank you.
So I think it's very clear that Pacific Island leaders and Pacific Island nations who want to be heard on climate change are being heard and are taking the best interests of their people in quick stead on the international stage. I think what's more concerning, though, are for the Pacific Island nations that don't have a voice within the UNFCCC in light of the United States. So these would be the countries or states that have a very close relationship with the United States and as a result aren't recognized as countries or a constituent member of the UNFCCC. So for example, the federal states of Micronesia, they only representative at the table for any UNFCCC or climate events is the United States. So I think for them, the problem is with being locked out of these negotiations if the United States is acting or talking for them. I also think, Guam, Hawaii, they're also going to be disproportionately affected by climate change due to their topography and being islands. So there is also an issue there. I think the Pacific, though, has been shown that the world and especially, like the EU are willing to ally themselves with us. And it really strongly reminded the US that they are one out of 198.
So sorry to be very technical, but all Pacific Island countries, the 14 independent self-governing states of the Pacific are all signatories of the UNFCCC and also the Paris Agreement. But I think if you're talking about the non-government, but at the government level, the Federated States of Micronesia is represented. Yeah, they are. I've been a member of the delegation, and Palau, and also the Republic of the Marshall Islands. They are all represented at the national level at the negotiations.
Any more questions from the audience?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rabia, and I work for Fiji Commerce Commission. I have a question, and this is directed to David Fay, that's from PRIF. So when we do infrastructure development, and it is near coastal areas, and there are certain, like mangroves are planted and we have to remove them so that we can do a greater development. So do you have any suggestions as to how we can improve our coastal areas as well as improving infrastructure? As such, in Fiji, there's a development going in Vatwanga at the moment where the Stinson's Bridge is being upgraded. And for that to be upgraded, the coastal area around that has been removed. And so do you have any suggestions as to how coastal protection and infrastructure improvement can go hand in hand together? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. There is an extensive safeguards policy statement that the ADB has in place to ensure that if a project does result in the removal of sensitive environmental assets, then other measures must be put in place to make sure that the project overall returns the environment to a better than before project case. Obviously, the removal of mangroves is avoidable, and we would look to change alignments. Preferably, we would keep roads away from coastlines with the avoidance objective. But this is always a significant discussion. When a project officer is considering a loan, the first thing they need to do is to categorise a project, and when they come up to the board, there's always this question. So the bank goes to great lengths to try to mitigate damage and to leave the country in a better state post-project. And then there is always the tension that governments say, well, we need this infrastructure, this is critical to access, this is critical to job development and the advance of our society. So the question is a difficult one, and we address it on a project-by-project basis, and we have extended, sometimes often very painful processes to make sure that we do the job properly.
Thank you very much. I've been asked by the organizers to wrap up. And I would like to thank again the panelists for this session. They've provided us with quite a lot of information on different aspects of climate change adaptation and resilience. As Tobagas has outlined, we need to, at the country level, to look at our macroeconomic policies to ensure that climate change and disaster is mainstreamed in our policies. And as that includes also our assets, and as David has outlined, it's not about just building a seawall or road, it's about the quality, and it's also about incorporating the knowledge that is already there in terms of protection of our coastline. And as Scott has outlined, it's about partnership to ensuring that we maximize what is out there, what is happening now through our partnership with our different stakeholders, and that's not just development partners, it's also our stakeholders at the community level, the non-state actors, the private sector. And then there's also the issue about the global influences, what is out there, as Kaya has outlined, being coastal states and with the impact of climate change, existing international laws that dictate our sovereignty are things that need to be, the discussions need to be ongoing in this respect. And I think the panelists have presented further food for thought for all of you out there. And they're here at this point in time. If you still want to discuss further with them, please come forward and get their contact details and everything like that. And again, please join me in showing our appreciation for the panelists for this session. Thank you very much. And this session is concluded, and I think Prince has some announcement.
Okay, thank you, Tia. Thank you for all the panelists. We can now have our afternoon tea to the same tent outside. And then please come back after 30 minutes for the last parallel session for today. See you. Thank you very much.
Prince, I need to make a little edit to my presentation, just a little bit, just to make sure. Uh, yeah, this one. I think that one. Yeah, just a little bit. Yep, I think I have to put from. I have to put.
With this disaster response team, last year we also had a session of disaster response, but they are mostly academics working on the
So at the end of today, I'll just go to
basically research and survey type. Then this year we're having more of the ground disaster response research by your group, and then the other one by the Red Cross and the International Humanitarian Group. So actually interesting to see contrast different types of research, but even if these are, because if you look at our program from last year, most of the sessions are actually same title, but if you see the content of the presentations, it's quite different. There's some a bit of range in terms of.
It's a huge file, that's why.
Okay.
Takes a while.
So it came through on the email, okay? The entire presentation?
Yes. Yeah. I was able to download it. Probably.
Thanks, Prince.
To the panel of presenters. Sorry, ask her that. I apologize for that we don't have her name. Yeah, she's part of the group of three. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're a group of three.
So if yeah, six of them. Thanks, Scott. You need.
Yeah, do you mind if I get a copy of the presentation?
Okay.
What's the best thing to do?
They're actually trying to upload it right now. So if you go to the website of USP,
Okay.
it should be available by the end of the day.
Okay,
All
great.
the presentations.
No worries, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I'm presenting on disaster risk reduction at the community level.
Yeah, no, no.
It's an example of the framework in practice.
It is.
Yes.
Yes, I think we
I
met
think
at
I read somewhere.
the finance forum last
Last December.
more later. I'm just going to check my presentation.
So,
Okay. This is why I wanted to check. Oh, okay. It came
wait,
up. Oh, Word, but it
it's
hasn't downloaded the pictures properly. Let's see. Oh, it's not downloaded properly. Okay, so.
no. So
Okay, I have it on here, but the one I gave you on email is the one I prefer to go online because this one has lots of messy notes on it. So,
okay.
or can you try and download the new one? Sorry.
all risks in this section.
Hi, everybody. If you could just take a seat, we might try and get started. It's a couple of minutes past 4 already. This session, just to check you're all in the right room, is on disaster response and risk reduction. So we're following on a little bit from the previous session that was looking at a similar set of issues. I'm Emma Veve. I'm a director in the Pacific Department at ADB in Manila, and I'm your chair for this session. We've got a number of panelists who will be talking on the topic of disaster response and risk reduction. Bulk of them sitting so they can see the slides, and with me is Megan Chisholm from CARE, who'll be the first speaker. But just a few words to sort of give some context for this session. Clearly, being here in the Pacific, you'd all be aware that Pacific countries are very, very prone to natural disasters. Pacific countries frequently appear in the sort of top 10 lists of most disaster-prone countries. Vanuatu in particular comes near the top of the list, if not the top of the list in the world. So it's a very pertinent issue we're talking about this afternoon. What sort of experience over the years has shown is that sound risk reduction activities, for example, climate proofing of infrastructure, appropriate policies and plans, community awareness and training, all help to put countries in a better position to respond post-disasters by creating less problems to begin with. But also faster, well-targeted responses does help to minimise the medium to long-term social, financial and economic impacts of disasters. Hence, what we're talking about here is important for both economic and financial reasons as well as social reasons. At last year's Pacific Update Conference, one of my colleagues shared our intent to support a contingent credit line for the Cook Islands, which I'm pleased to say we had approved by our board last December. That means we'd worked with the Cook Islands to improve their disaster risk management activities, and we provide a $10 million US credit line that they can draw upon in the case of disasters to respond to those disasters. So this year, I can tell you that we're working on expanding that and looking at a regional approach across 5 countries, which are some of the most disaster-prone countries in the Pacific, and we'll pilot it there and look to expanding. Similar thing, working with the countries to improve their disaster risk reduction activities and their disaster risk management, and providing, in this case, a contingent savings facility that countries can draw down upon in the event of disasters, and help to do some of the many things that the people here on this afternoon's panel will be talking about. So if I can begin, our first speaker will be Megan Chisholm, who is the Country Director of Care International in Vanuatu. She's going to pose the question, does community-based disaster risk reduction make a difference in the face of a Category 5 cyclone? Something clearly that the experience in Vanuatu will allow her to answer. So Megan, if you'd like to go ahead.
How about that? Yes, that's better. Okay, thanks for joining. It's the afternoon session, so it's always a difficult one. Does disaster risk reduction work, and specifically gender-responsive, community-based disaster risk reduction? The problem with disaster risk reduction is that it's really hard to prove success, because success is when a disaster doesn't happen. So it's got that reverse logic. If you've been successful, nothing happens. So it's very difficult to show the evidence that it works. So particularly in the area of disaster risk reduction, I think we're often challenged in terms of our evidence and in terms of the monitoring and evaluation systems and tools that we use in order to really prove what the impact of our programs are in terms of community-based disaster risk reduction. So it's a challenge for the sector in general. When Cyclone Pam hit, I expect everybody in this room is quite familiar with Cyclone Pam. It was a Category 5 cyclone with the strongest winds that had ever been recorded in the Pacific, and it affected 80% of Vanuatu's population and had a devastating impact on the communities that were affected and the nation as a whole. So in Vanuatu, CARE had been working for a number of years on disaster risk reduction programs. So we work in the Tawhaya province, which is the southernmost part of Vanuatu. And as you're aware, Vanuatu is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, not only the region but in the world. And the area that we work in Tawhaya is extremely remote, isolated, culturally diverse, and there's high levels of gender inequality. So Cyclone Pam was, a tremendous disaster for the communities that were there, but it also provided a learning opportunity in terms of looking at how disaster risk reduction helped communities to prepare and to respond to that emergency. So CARE had been working since 2011 in Tawhaya province on community-based disaster risk reduction, and specifically in two communities that I'm going to talk about, and on two islands of Aniwa and Erromango in Tawhaya province, but we'd been working there since 2013. So that means we had 2 years of community-based disaster risk reduction programming that had happened on the ground when those communities then faced up against Category 5 Tropical Cyclone Pam. So after Cyclone Pam, we started to hear the stories from the communities and how they faced the cyclone and how what they'd learned during disaster risk reduction programming had made a difference. So we decided this was a good opportunity to try and test some of the theories that we'd applied in the disaster risk reduction programming and see if there was indeed more than anecdotal data, but some actual robust evidence that demonstrated the impact of disaster risk reduction. And that's the study that I'm going to talk about today. So to start with, CARE's program works with community disaster and climate change committees. And you heard in the previous session around the importance in the framework for resilient development that the integration of climate change and disasters is very key. So we work with communities that are integrating disaster management and climate change adaptation on the ground where they live. CARE's program involves facilitating risk assessment, community-based planning, training, simulations, provision of equipment, and a quite comprehensive and intensive investment in supporting community programming. We also focus on gender and social inclusion. So we place a very strong emphasis on supporting women's involvement and leadership in disaster risk reduction, supporting communities to ensure that women take leadership roles in the CDCCCs, the Community Disaster Committees, providing training for all community leaders on gender and social inclusion, and really putting that at the forefront of our disaster risk reduction approach. And I'll just say too, for the work that, the type of work we do at the community, the National Disaster Management Office has since put all of those tools and resources into a handbook and adopted that as a national approach to community-based disaster risk reduction. So that's this small handbook I've got here. So if anyone's interested in more, you can have a look at that later. So what we did to look at what evidence we had about how this did or didn't make a difference to communities affected by Cyclone Pam, we did a comparative study. So we approached one group as what you might call a treatment group, communities who had been part of CARE's disaster risk reduction programs, and they were communities on Erromango and Aniwa, with a control group, and they were communities on Tanna, who had not previously engaged in disaster risk reduction work, so they'd had no involvement in any disaster risk reduction programs prior to Cyclone Pam. Based on the three research questions we looked at then in those different communities was, how did the community actions differ before, during and after Tropical Cyclone Pam? What effect did those differences have on damage and recovery? And were there gender and social inclusion differences between the communities? We looked at a checklist that was based on the government's formal advice on what you should do during an emergency. So we used the Vanuatu government's disaster risk reduction checklist to look at what did the communities do in practice in the face of Cyclone Pam compared to the recommended actions from the government for disaster preparedness. And we looked at what they did at each stage of the alert. So you have 5 stages, 24 hours before, 12 hours before, red being during the cyclone, immediately after, and then in the recovery, initial recovery phase. So we used an independent consultant and a team of national staff who did key informant interviews, focus group discussions, transect walks, and used other participatory research methods with communities to look at what they did in the face of Cyclone Pam, and then scored them against this checklist so that each community got a score at each phase of the alert. So, I'm going to work computer. Okay, so did the disaster risk reduction program make a difference? So these are the scores. Now there's something important I have to highlight for you because it's quite hard to see on this. The first column is the communities from Aniwa and the scores that they got. The second column in the graph, the light orange, is the communities on Erromango that had both participated in disaster risk reduction. The communities that hadn't participated in disaster risk reduction are the very pale orange, and I'm sorry you can't see it very well there, but if you see these tiny little scores in the third column on each one, are the communities with disaster risk reduction, who had not participated in disaster risk reduction. So what this tells us is that communities who had participated in disaster risk reduction programs achieved a score of between 70 to 100% across all five phases of the alert. So they did what they were supposed to do. They did exactly what the National Disaster Management Office recommended to them. The lowest score in the 70% related to not having enough food in some safe houses. But they prepared food, they got into safe houses, they had a committee established that was responding to the disaster, they secured their boats and their household supplies, they completed assessment forms. They did a textbook response to the emergency. The communities that had not been involved in DRR scored between 0 and 12% across every phase, which means they didn't do anything that they should have done, according to the NDMO handbook, because they just didn't know. So they weren't in safe houses, they were in their own homes, asleep in the middle of the cyclone. They hadn't prepared food. They had ran around in the middle of the cyclone as the houses blew down around them. So it was quite compelling results that even if you just look at it from a numeric perspective without getting into those stories, that the communities that had been through community-based disaster risk reduction training really did know what to do and were able to cope better with the cyclone. And so we've got the numbers there, but it's really It's really the human stories that I think illustrate it better. So I just want to tell you about two communities. So I'll give you an example. So Ematu is a community on Aniwa. They had a person who was chair of the CDC, the Community Disaster and Climate Change Committee, who coordinated the response. They had a female chairperson, and she handed out information about all of the alerts around the cyclone from her house. The community worked together, and they prepared things, and they moved into identified safe houses. They helped to move people with disability and vulnerable groups into safe houses. And then during the cyclone, they had CDC members who stayed on guard during the cyclone and monitored what damage was going on. The day after the emergency, they filled in completed assessment reports that followed the recommended format from the NGMO, and they sent that straight off, a full and completed initial rapid assessment, they sent that straight off to the Provincial Disaster Office. An example from Erromango that had been part of disaster risk reduction programs. In Dillons Bay, there was 615 people who live in Dillons Bay, and the community worked together again with the Community Disaster and Climate Change Committee to work out which houses were safest. They prepared food, they went to the gardens and harvested food, and then they also secured their boats. So they moved all of their boats inland and they weighted them down, and they then, stayed in the houses until they got through the cyclone, and then again did an assessment once the cyclone was finished. In the community on White Sands, the community received the alerts, but they didn't understand them. They didn't know what they meant. So category 5, is that good or bad? Is 1 high or is 5 high? They weren't sure what the strength meant. It's at J5 of the tracking map. Well, where's J5 or L2? Where is that? We don't know what that means. They also didn't believe them. They said, we haven't had a cyclone for a long time. We've had alerts before, so we don't actually believe the alerts. So they did nothing. Some women reported that they said, maybe we should go to the garden, and their husbands said, no, we're not going to have a cyclone. Don't bother preparing the food or harvesting anything from the garden. When the cyclone came, people went to bed in their own houses without having prepared their houses and without being in safe houses. So people went to sleep in their beds in their own family house. They weren't in safe houses, and the majority had not prepared their houses, although some started to tie down their roofs when the wind was already strong. The result was then that people were running around in the height of the cyclone, moving from house to house as the house blew down around them. So it was extremely dangerous. They didn't move their boats up. They lost all of their boats, and they had significant injuries. So there was a case, this is the community of YCC that I'm talking about. So they had a case of a boy being trapped under a fallen tree, a man speared with flying wood, and a woman and her child being lifted up and thrown into the trees behind them. And this was all from moving around during the time not only of the cyclone but a storm surge. So these were radically different experiences that these communities had depending on whether they had been through that training or not. So based on this, we think that it does make a very big difference to how communities experienced the cyclone. We can also look at the issue of damages. And so, one part of the question was how did disaster risk reduction make a difference to the actions that communities took? But the other part of the question was, how did it make a difference to the damages sustained? This is a much trickier one to answer. It's very difficult in terms of the evidence because the characteristics of the wind and the geography and the closeness to the cyclone are all variables that it's difficult to adjust for. However, we believe based on this study it's likely that the disaster risk reduction programs did help communities reduce their losses. So we say this on the basis of the fact that the storm, if you look at the storm path, it passed over Erromango, directly over the communities in Erromango that we worked with, and then it also passed over Tanna. So Tanna and Erromango both had very destructive winds, and Niwa had less destructive winds, which may have resulted in less damage. But the communities that had prepared, had tied down their houses, had moved and secured their boats inland, had secured their personal items, sustained 59 to 81% of houses sustaining serious damage, compared to the communities that hadn't been in disaster risk reduction programs sustaining 94 to 96%. in the two areas where there were very destructive winds. There were also lots of other stories about the damages that were minimised. So I mentioned the boats, that the communities that secured their boats were able to go fishing again straight away. The food, communities that had prepared and harvested food had food for 2 weeks after the cyclone. Communities that had not prepared food were eating fruit that had fallen off the ground and what they could salvage in the aftermath of the cyclone, which lasted about 2 days before they needed support from emergency relief. Similarly, around personal items and household items, there was a difference in those who had taken action to protect their assets and those who hadn't. The other, sorry, and also in terms of, we also looked at recovery, how communities recovered. We found that communities in Namibia felt that they were closer to being back to normal. Communities in Aramanga were halfway back to normal, and this was partly a product of El Nino and the fact that after Cyclone Pam were still very much suffering from El Nino, whereas the communities in Tanna felt they were less close to recovery. But that's also exacerbated by the volcano having a greater impact on communities in recent years, exacerbated by loss of foliage after Cyclone Pam. The other aspect that we looked at was the gender and social inclusion aspects of the work and of how communities responded. What we found was that in communities where there were not participants in disaster risk reduction, households prepared and responded alone. So they use the term 1-1-1-1-1. So they prepared as a family in their household, not as a whole community. Women's concerns were not necessarily listened to, and women were not involved in leadership and decision making. Vulnerable people, in particular people with disability, were cared for by their family and seen as a family responsibility. And it was quite clear when we did interviews, and this is obviously something hard to measure, but there was still a very strong sense of trauma around the cyclone at the time of the study. But what we found in communities that had been part of disaster risk reduction programs is that the community worked together as a whole because they had a disaster community with specific roles that men and women were part of, and the community had trained together, they prepared together, and they responded together. So they came together in community safe houses, they looked out for other community members. Women and men shared roles, and women were confident, engaged in decision-making and leadership. And the really interesting thing is that vulnerable people in the community were treated as a community responsibility. So where people need extra support, the community provided that, as opposed to being a responsibility for family. And the other intangible thing was that there's a deficit pride from communities about the way when they talked about how they responded, there was a strong sense of pride about how they managed it. So the conclusion of the report is that we do believe that the gender responsive disaster risk reduction helped to reduce the impact and the damage from Tropical Cyclone Pam, and that this provides evidence from that, and that it really transformed disaster management, the focus on gender and social inclusion, transformed disaster management from a household responsibility to a community responsibility, and particularly where men and women are both engaged in leadership roles and working together. In terms of some recommendations that came out of the study, disaster risk reduction should be an investment priority. It does work, and it makes a huge difference to communities that face disaster risk and climate risk all the time, particularly obviously in the Pacific. So we believe community-based disaster risk reduction must be an investment priority. It also needs long-term engagement. I haven't talked about this a lot, but CARES programs for these communities was sustained support over a 2-year period. We did come across in some other communities, a community that might have had a one-off training in disaster risk reduction 5 or 6 years ago, and the evidence we saw, even though they're not included in this study, suggested that that was not effective and didn't make any difference. So one of the key findings is that it does involve long-term engagement with communities and a significant investment to empowering communities to manage disaster risks. It's really key to focus on trusted leaders in the community. So having those CDC members who were trusted leaders really helped people take on board the alerts and work together as a community. And those leaders, of course, must be both men and women, and that women's leadership is really critical. And so a focus on gender equality and inclusiveness provides a much stronger approach to community-based disaster risk reduction than one that doesn't. Finally, they were the recommendations. In terms of future research, one of the questions for us, I guess, still is around the sustainability in terms of, I said we've been providing those communities in the study with 2 years of intensive support. And we believe it needs that kind of investment to be effective. So of course the immediate question is, okay, well how long do you have to provide that investment for? At what point does it become sustainable? So that's a question that we've got on our table and on our minds, and something that we hope we can do future research into in the future. And I think I'm right on time, and I'll just mention that there are copies of the full report up the back, I think. If there's none left, then I've got a few more, if anybody's after a copy of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for sharing those quite enlightening details of the data and the proof that you've collected that shows the real benefits coming out of gender-responsive disaster risk reduction at the community level. Now, our next presenter is Jesse Doyle. Jesse is a labour migration specialist at the World Bank. And this afternoon, he too has a question. Does manna from heaven help? And he's looking at the role of cash transfers in disaster recovery, and in particular, lessons from Tropical Cyclone Winston here in Fiji. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks to everyone for joining this afternoon. I'm going to be presenting the results from an impact evaluation that we carried out last year, looking at the impact of cash transfers provided by the government of Fiji in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Winston. I wrote the paper with a couple of co-authors at the bank, Alexia Vishenko, Jae-Kun Kim, and Jonathan Sibley, who unfortunately couldn't make it this afternoon. Tropical Cyclone Winston hit on February 20th last year. It was the most devastating cyclone to have hit the region. Wind speeds of up to 285 kilometres per hour, 62% of the population impacted, and damage and losses of $1 billion US, or about 22% of gross domestic product. When you look at the path that the cyclone took through Fiji, it came across the Eastern Division and then almost cut directly through Vanuatu and Viti Levu, and on its way hit some of the poorest provinces in the country. Ra on the north coast of Viti Levu, and Bua on the south coast of Vanuatu. And these were the provinces that formed the core of our sample for the impact evaluation. In terms of the timeline for the government's response, the first line of assistance from the government was really to open up the Fiji National Provident Fund for withdrawals. So on February 29th, the Provident Fund basically permitted members to take out $1,000 of their retirement savings and up to $5,000 for members who had proof of property title in an affected area. And that window was open for 60 days. Subsequent to that, on March 18th, the government put in an extra $20 million into their three core social protection programs: the Poverty Benefit Scheme, which is a poverty-targeted cash transfer, the Care and Protection Allowance, which is a child benefit scheme, and the Social Pension Scheme, which is basically a retirement scheme for those who aren't part of the Provident Fund. And these three programs formed the basis of our impact evaluation. Further down the line, on May 24th, they opened up a line of assistance which came to be known as the Help for Homes Initiative, and this was basically a housing voucher for households that were below an income earning capacity of $50,000 per year. We actually didn't really cover this in the evaluation because the surveys were carried out from June 7th to July 1st. So these were the three core programs that we focused on. As I mentioned before, the Poverty Benefit Scheme was the largest scheme, 23,000 households. And what the government did was provided an extra $600 for beneficiaries of that program as a lump sum transfer. For the other two programs, the Care and Protection Allowance and the Social Pension Scheme, a lump sum transfer of $300 was provided on March 18th, so about a month after the cyclone hit. The impact evaluation itself was funded through the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And what we did was adopted what's called a regression discontinuity design method. And basically that means that we took advantage of the fact that this poverty benefit scheme has a cutoff point. So if you want to become a beneficiary under the program, you basically nominate yourself as poor. A social welfare officer comes out to your house with a questionnaire which looks at the household assets you have and the demographic characteristics of the household. And then they put that into a database and it spits out a score. And if you're above that score, you miss out on the program. And if you're below the score, you become eligible for the scheme. So we took a sample that was 20% above this cutoff point and 20% below. And then we randomly selected taquinas from within that group, both inside and outside the affected areas. The impact evaluation component was confined to the poverty benefit scheme. And we took 275 households as the treatment group, so those that received the assistance, and they were in affected areas, and then 270 households as the control group. So those were households that had applied for the program, but were not eligible to receive the assistance. And basically what we wanted to do was to understand what the impacts of the top-up assistance were for those households that received it. Now, what's critical for any impact evaluation is that the baseline characteristics are the same between the treatment and control groups. And for our sample, this was indeed the case. Whether you were looking at their access to electricity, the number of rooms that they had in their dwelling, the age of the household head, or the cooking fuel that they used in the family kitchen. The shocks that they experienced in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Winston were also essentially the same. Looking at a range of different shocks from total loss of dwelling to damage incurred to the roofing, to loss of livestock and loss of food stocks. So between those two sort of stylized facts, we had a really strong basis for teasing out the impacts of the top-up assistance. Market access is obviously critical when you're dealing with cash. And what we found was that before the cyclone hit, about 84% of households had regular access to a local market. And once Tropical Cyclone Winston hit, this went down to about 30% in the week after the cyclone. And then this was restored after about a month. So in terms of the timeliness of the top-up transfers, it almost worked out perfectly because once this market access was restored, the payments were dispersed into the beneficiary accounts. This was on March 18th. And what we found was that 76% of households withdrew their payments within the first month of having received them. What was actually quite surprising was that the awareness of the top-up payments was fairly low. So only 47% of the beneficiaries were aware that the money would actually be coming into their account. And of that, a smaller fraction were aware of the actual intent of the payment. In terms of how long it took the households to actually spend the top-up cash transfers, over 75% had spent the transfers within 4 weeks of it having been dispersed to their account. So it goes to show that there was a real need for this assistance. A lot of households lost productive assets, and these are the types of things that they spent the assistance on. One surprising finding was that households who received the top-up cash transfers didn't really share them with other households or communities. And this was part of the rationale for providing assistance not just to affected areas, but also to non-affected areas, as the government thought that that money would flow through to their extended kinship networks in affected areas, and this simply didn't happen. So less than 10% of households actually shared the money that they received with other households. The money was spent on the right things. So over 99% was spent on what we termed as essential items, which were things like food, clothing, school supplies, medical supplies, household goods and products. Less than 1% was spent on non-essential items, so things like kava, cigarettes and alcohol. And this was a big fear for the government before the payments were dispersed, was that the money would essentially be wasted by the beneficiary households, and this simply wasn't the case. And as a result of the fact that the money was dispersed in a timely fashion and households spent the money on essential items for their recovery, what we found was that beneficiary households that received the assistance recovered far quicker from a range of different shocks. And we looked at things like their ability to repair their dwelling, repair their agricultural land, replenish their food stocks, and return to work. And across all of these different shocks, the households who received this top-up cash payment, which was relatively large in terms of the household income, $600 for the Poverty Benefit Scheme beneficiaries and $300 for the other schemes, it basically gave them a way to recover quicker than they otherwise would have been able to. So in conclusion, what we can say is that the intervention worked as intended. In fact, it worked spectacularly well. But moving forward, there are a number of lessons that came out of this evaluation. I think the first is that a better targeted information campaign is needed, so households know why this money is actually being sent out to them by the government. A second would be that it's critical to focus not just on poor households, but also on near poor households. So under this poverty benefit scheme, it's just the 10% of poorest households who receive assistance. But in effect, households that are above that poverty line, they are subject to the exact same set of shocks. And so they also need cash assistance from the government. And so it's critical to think about how we can build those databases so that the programs can scale up and cover not just the poor, but also the near poor. And then one final point would be, I think it's critical to look at the sequencing of in-kind and cash support. What we found was that market access was wiped out initial month after the cyclone, and so cash wouldn't have been an appropriate response for that first 4 weeks, but very quickly after households regained their access to markets, cash was a real powerful intervention. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse, for sharing the information on how the cash transfer went in Fiji. I'm sure that will be of interest to other governments, other organisations, thinking of supporting similar in the wake of disasters in other Pacific countries. Our final speakers, and I say speakers because there's 3 of them, will be talking about talking on the topic of achieving a more appropriate and fit for purpose humanitarian disaster response ecosystem in the Pacific. I'll introduce all 3 up front. They might want to reintroduce themselves as they come up to talk. We have Susan Slattery from the Australian Red Cross, Linda Kenny, who is an independent researcher and formerly with the Pacific Institute for Public Policy, and Raylala Nakemba, who is an assistant professor at the Fiji National University. So Susan, I'll ask you to talk first.
A bit shorter, thanks. Hi everyone. Thanks for having us. Just want to thank USP, ADB and ANU for allowing us to come and talk about our research today. We're excited to be here, and we are going to be playing tag team throughout our presentation, so we'll try and be swift. So just apologies for the mouthful that is the title there, but looking at achieving a more appropriate fit-for-purpose humanitarian ecosystem in the Pacific. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about what the drivers for the research were. Australian Red Cross, which is where I'm from, early last year, did a literature review around localisation. So that's a term that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and if not, then it will become part of your daily language very shortly. That was in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, which was in May of 2016. Basically, the literature review showed that there was a huge number of issues, there's a wide variety of them, that there was we had little evidence around what localisation was and how we could do it, but there were a huge number of aspirations that essentially we wanted to do it, we just weren't quite sure what it meant, beyond what we were already doing. Another key driver was the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, which was the agreement that came out of the World Humanitarian Summit. Essentially, there's a whole host of things that are part of that, but essentially what that said was that there was a need to reform the humanitarian system, and a high priority was placed on localising humanitarian response. And a really key part of that was commitment from donors and actors to make that work, for us to understand what that is and how that can work. Another key driver for the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is our structure. Localisation, or the structure of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we're 190 independent organisations globally supported by the Secretariat of the International Federation of the Red Cross, and with the other part of our movement being the International Committee of the Red Cross. In humanitarian response, we have local, national and international responsibilities and a whole structure set up around what we do in humanitarian response. Essentially, localising humanitarian response is part of what we do. It's the way that we operate, but we know that we can do it better, and so that's what we wanted to try and understand through this research. And lastly, but certainly by no means the least, the Pacific is a really key focus area for the Australian Red Cross. In order to understand what that localisation looks like and what that means, Australian Red Cross really wanted to hear from the Pacific what it means to them, to national societies across the Pacific, and how we can be better partners in that process. Which leads me to our research itself. So the research is being conducted by a consortium, the Deakin University's Centre for Humanitarian Leadership, Fiji National University, and the Humanitarian Advisory Group, and for our researchers who are from the countries within which the research is being conducted. And those countries are Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, and PNG. And so you'll hear from two of those researchers in just a moment. The key question that the research asks is, what would a successfully localised disaster management ecosystem in the Pacific look like? And what changes to the Red Cross and the broader humanitarian system need to make it get there, need to be made to get there? It's quite a mouthful, so apologies. What next? So at the moment, basically where we're up to is the research has been or is currently being undertaken. It's close to being finalised. So Railala and Linda will give you a bit of an overview of where things are up to now. But essentially, we're putting out regular updates, the first of which is here. I have a few copies. I'll pop them up the back if anyone's interested, or I can email them to you if you would like one. It's an insight paper. The research findings themselves will be available in mid-July, so some of the data analysis is happening literally as we speak in Melbourne with the Humanitarian Advisory Group. From that, Australian Red Cross will be able to assess, what does need to change in order to improve support to localisation. So culturally, leadership-wise, practice, in the way that we practice, and any systems. So the findings will inform an organisational policy for Australian Red Cross, and we anticipate that the findings will have a broader implication across the sector. There will be obviously Australian Red Cross and also our national societies and federation partners. It will help us to find or figure out what our advocacy position is, so hearing directly from our partners in the Pacific about what we should be doing to support that process. And it will, in general, build on the research which is being undertaken globally. So this will obviously be specific to the Pacific, but it will help create that comprehensive picture of localisation around the world. So that's my part. I'm going to ask Railala to come up, and we'll do a quick tag.
Good afternoon, all. I'm just going to continue from what was presented earlier on the importance of localization. And based on this question, why localization is important, reflections and observations from both Fiji and Vanuatu will be presented this afternoon. Importance to know, so important to know about the approach that we took in this research. The branch-arrest diagram that you can see on the slide above here above you are the very rational and advantages that we took, or approach that we took on this approach, or on this research. Again, I would ask, somebody would ask why we took this approach, because it is more appropriate in the Pacific context, more cost efficient and more cost effective. and encourages more local dialogues, dialogues like the focus group discussion or the similar Talano sessions that has been constantly used across the spectrum for research. Some of the research tools that we have adopted or we have used in this process includes the key informants interviews for INGOs or NGOs, the government sectors, the focus group discussions, and visioning exercises, a couple of storytelling and case studies that also helped us in retrieving information or data from the field. The research process that we undertake in this research, the general, I could say that this is just the general research or the process that was undertaken by the team. First, the team set in Suva way back in January for a one-week workshop to undergo the methodology or the methods to be undertaken in this research. So that includes the local representatives from PNG, from Tonga, Vanuatu. IFRC was also invited, Fiji Red Cross. So that helped us to define the problem. With all the inputs from national representatives, we were able to write or draft the terms of reference for localization. And again, the second phase that we did was the review of the literature, and it was presented earlier on. And based on those national documents and the diverse resources that the team were able to access, we were able to come up with the literature. And thirdly, the third phase, the designing of the methodology. Designing of the methodology was basically to test the methodology or the tools that we have decided to use in the study. Like I mentioned earlier, the key informants interview, the visioning exercises, and based on the designing of the methodology, we included teams from our own team, our research team, and also the team from the Fiji Red Cross, from the IFRC, to be part of our designing team. And as it was indicated earlier, that the research is currently ongoing, so some of the information gathering is still ongoing, and we are in the process of summing up the research, and we'll come to the next phase, which is interpretation of results and information or data that was collected from the 4 countries. And based on the localization, based on that workshop, based on what we had designed, the design methodology workshop that took place in Suva, we were able to demarcate our roles for the researchers that were there, and part of our clearance or part of the designing of our research is to get clearance for human ethics or local clearance requirements. And what you can see also on the slide are it's not a refined definition of localization, but at the end of that week, we were able to come up with a definition of localization, which is basically what some of the organization, or some of the national or some of the NGOs and INGOs, or even government bodies or government departments or institutions are currently practicing. A process of recognizing or respecting the strengthening and local leadership and decision making by national actors. As it is, it's like I said, it's not refined. The definition of localization is not refined. Most probably by the end of this research, or by the duration of this research project, it will be defined to the satisfaction of the Red Cross, or the ARC. Thank you.
So my task here now is to just to give you the perspective or reflections on what people were telling us when we were interviewing them. Interviewing them on what they think localization is to them. There were many of the different things that were coming out from our interviews. They were giving a lot of different things they think that should be what localization is to them, but I'm just going to go briefly through some of the things the common things that were coming up. One being that having the capacity in place. So realizing one of the things that was coming out from people who were interviewing was realizing that the government and the people at the national and local community level have the capacity and that they should lead more, and that the leading from the INGOs should be less, but also that needing the INGOs to support them where there is gap, so to build up the capacity where there is gap, so government and the people can take up the responsibility to better respond in time of disasters. The other thing also, the other point that was coming out also was leadership and decision making, that there should be more of that coming from the government and the local people instead of the international actors or humanitarian actors. Another thing that was coming out from people who were interviewing was that there should be better coordination with the government, and that respect should be given to the institutions who were carrying out the response at that time. Another one was building up capacity, that where there are gaps, that people should, that the people's capacity should be built at the national and also at the local level, so they can be empowered to respond better to any disaster at the recovery stage and also at the rehabilitation stage. Another thing that came out was that the INGOs, to learn more about the people and about their culture and their priorities. Sometimes when they go in during the response, that they just go in with whatever they think is suited for the people, and at times it's not always what the people needed at that time, so that there should be a learning, there should be more learning between the two, the people and their culture, between the INGOs, people from the community also learning about what the INGOs are doing. So just to go through again, when we were collecting the information, we were using KII and the visioning exercise. Visioning exercise is where we were asking people what they want to see change, and those specific changes, how they're going to bring that about, and so that we can have a more localized humanitarian response or action in the Pacific. So I think just to summarize all is just to realize that the people and the government, they have that capacity, and where there is no capacity, that it should be supported, and that can be supported through the INGOs that we have, local humanitarian people, actors on the ground, realizing that there are some capacities also that should be built, and that leadership and decision making are made by the locals, and that they should be respected, and not to always rely on knowledge or whatever is coming from outside, because already people have that knowledge, and that can be supported through different programs, and one being the CDCs, that the NTMO in Vanuatu are doing, the clusters that are being supported by the government and the NGOs, and that's a good way of how we can see people working together to respond to any disaster in the humanitarian action or response. Thank you.
So thank you, Linda, Ray, Lara and Susan. If you could come up the front, I'll open the floor at this point to any questions you may have. I have a few questions coming to mind, but I would much rather hear from you, the audience, and you've stayed here till 5 o'clock, by which I'm very impressed. So please put up your hand if you have a question. We have one brave soul. Tess, thank you.
Hi, I'm Tess Newton-Kane. I'm with the Development Policy Centre at the ANU. Jessie, thank you for that. I now know more about cash transfers than I did. You said that the government expected and possibly hoped that the money would move throughout the community using kinship networks, and that your study showed that that didn't happen. I guess my question is a kind of so what question. What does this mean in terms of government thinking for using a methodology of this type again? So what is the follow-on from that? Does it have any impact in what happens next, or is it just an interesting thing that we now know that we didn't know before? Thanks.
Thanks, Tess. That's a good question. I think the policy response is that, it's basically important to geographically target these transfers. So before the response was sent out, there was a question as to whether you focus just on affected areas or whether you also channel that assistance to non-affected areas. And the decision was made to focus on both. And part of it was for the reason that I outlined, is that there was an expectation that it would be channeled through extended kinship networks. But a second sort of rationale was that it would stimulate the local economy. I think if you've got a budget, if you've got a sort of a fiscal cap, it's more effective to channel a higher level of assistance to those households that need it most, which are inevitably those in affected areas, rather than those on the other side of the country where the cyclone didn't hit. Ultimately, it's a question for the government, and it's their decision. But the research that we've done, not just in Fiji but in other countries, shows that you can set these systems up to geographically target cash transfers, and that's the sort of needed policy response. Thanks.
Thanks. Anyone else? Sorry, Scott, hook up the back there. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, presenters, for what you've given us. It's very, very interesting and very good. First of all, for Megan for the first presentation. Thank you very much, Megan. I was just interested. You made that remark with regard to long-term engagement and being able to ensure that there's an uptake and a sort of, I guess, the knowledge being embedded into the communities. I'm aware that there's a UNDP-funded program called the Pacific Risk Resilience Program that operates in Vanuatu as well, and that's been operating for about the last 4 years. So I guess the thing is that, have you come across that program, I guess, is the first question. The second is that I know they've focused as well on community-based resilience building, and whether they have had, whether you've seen any sort of similar sort of results with regard to the communities that they've worked in as well. The other, part B question is for Linda and her, sorry, it's Louise, is it Louise? The last presenters, said it to Linda, sorry, the last group presenters. Apologies for that. I haven't got my glasses on, and my vision is rapidly deteriorating as I get older. But the question I've got is that I wanted to understand more clearly, when you're talking about the issue of localisation, what is being localised, and what are you focusing on in terms of the study that needs to be undertaken by the communities? The reason why I ask this is that, my own research that I did like a decade ago now focused on local communities focusing upon natural resource management. For example, looking at the locally marine managed networks that operate in Fiji and other countries, and about how the local communities take that ownership going forward. So, and identify, and there was identification of specific areas of what was actually being done with that localisation. So I'd appreciate to be able to understand, when you're talking about localisation of disaster risk reduction, what specific aspects are you talking about? How are the local communities identifying those particular areas that they think that they need to take leadership on? And how does that sort of complement, I guess, the work being done by at the provincial or the sub-national or national level going forward? Thank you for that. Sorry for the long questions.
That's okay. I'll pass to Megan, and then Linda and colleagues can decide.
Okay. Is there anyone from UNDP here who might be able to answer that question better than me before I give you an answer? So I'm familiar with the PRRP program. They've got lots of different strategies, and one of the main strategies that I've come across is that they are directly funding positions embedded in the government. So one example I'll give you is CARE is the co-lead of the Gender and Protection Cluster, and we do a lot of work around gender and protection. We do that with the Department of Women's Affairs, and we work very closely with the Department of Women's Affairs, and they provide tremendous leadership and a lot of active work around the Gender and Protection Cluster. The position in the Department of Women's Affairs that leads on the Gender and Protection Cluster, and many people would know Rotina Illo because she's often in things. Her position, I believe, is funded by PRRP. So that's a good example of where that program is contributing to mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation within the government. In terms of community-based work, I am aware that the program did support some local area planning and community-based work, but from my knowledge of it, it was not intensive, and so not to the same extent that we're talking about, and was a little bit more in the short-term intervention that we would say needs some more work. I believe it was complicated. I believe it was complicated by the fact that, Vanuatu is still developing its local area planning and bottom-up planning approaches, and so it's kind of linked to that. There are other organisations that are doing similar community-based work to what CARE's been doing now. So the French Red Cross, so CARE works in the Tafea province in the south, and the French Red Cross has been implementing very similar approaches in the north, in Torpa province. And Oxfam now is also picking up and doing the same model in Sheffer. So as I said, a lot of organisations have worked together with the NDMO to translate those approaches into this national approach that's now been adopted as the national approach, and this is the NDMO's handbook. So a lot of stakeholders are now implementing this approach, which is now owned by the NDMO, in different areas. So there is a lot of work going on, but the PRRP approach, my knowledge of it is it's a bit different.
Hi, Susan. I'm Susan. That's okay. Thanks for your question, Scott. So I think a few of us are going to tackle the answer. But to start with, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that the research is for Australian Red Cross in order for us to understand what that means. So localisation, as these guys tried to pull together, or did pull together, a definition of what localisation means, and it can mean so many things. So the question of, are we talking about regional, national, or local localisation? They're all things that are up for debate and part of the discussion more broadly. In this instance, we, as Australian Red Cross, are trying to understand how do we support our Pacific National Society partners, and what do we have to change about ourselves and the way that we operate in order to localise. And I think Railala is going to chat about the things themselves that will be localised. But I think the other really important thing for us to acknowledge, for Australian Red Cross and the Red Cross movement, and more broadly the sector, is around we're talking about humanitarian response, but that also is around the development side of our work as well, so that humanitarian development nexus, and that both sides of that, or both ends of that spectrum, are mutually reinforcing, so that when we're not just exclusively talking about humanitarian response, I'm trying to understand in my daily practice what that means for me as a development practitioner in my work with Fiji Red Cross. I hope that goes some way to answering your question, but I might get Railala to...
In addition to that, when we were going around interviewing people, one of the common response they said, we're already practicing localization. So it goes back to the definition of what we are trying to get through in terms of what is really that we are trying to localize. We look at leadership, strengthening leadership in terms of capacity, whether it's at national level, whether it's the social structures in the community, whether it's a community level, or whether we need additional help from international NGOs. And the other example too that also received or we understood from this is coordination in terms of coordinating humanitarian response. Yeah, Linda?
I think one of the, stop laughing, Anna. One of the main focus of this study was to see its own leadership and decision making, whether the locals are taking more lead in here or the internationals. So, and if the internationals are taking the lead, is it effective? If the locals are taking the lead, is it effective? So I think one of the focus was seeing the difference between how the international actors, humanitarian actors, were leading and making decisions compared if we were using the locals and the local government at the different levels, national and the community level, whether their decision making and leadership was more effective. I think that was one of the focus of this study. Thank you.
Hand up there in the middle, thanks.
Thank you for the presenters for their presentation. This is very much just a comment and sharing from our experience from Tonga, where we had, our organization had done a beneficiary validation exercise of the Cyclone Ian in 2014, which a lot of the support is coming from World Bank. The interesting thing that we find in terms of relations to women was that in a situation like humanitarian, in response, a lot of our people don't really ask very much questions. They're at the recipient end, where they're just appreciating whatever it's been given to them without really asking any questions related to what is it really that they're right, that they're, you know, the human right perspective into humanitarian was one of the key things that was identified from the study that we have been involved in. And the interesting thing is that we, when the World Bank and the government were developing the criteria for the selections of these families to have their houses rebuilt as part of the response, they miss out totally the land issue. It was not part of the vulnerability criteria. And when we went out to do the validation, that was when we realized that the women are totally being displaced with our tenuous system because they don't own land. So that was just a comment to the response that sometimes when we do survey study like this, we may be trying to localize, which I like the idea, but localization sometimes need us to look into deeper issue, such as land, that sometimes we just shy away from because it's just too tough. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I can just maybe add something there. I think, you know, to me, one of the points you highlight is the importance of that deep gender analysis, even in an emergency context. And so, you know, as I mentioned the example that we work very closely in Vanuatu with Department of Women's Affairs on the Gender and Protection Cluster, and we invest a lot in the work around preparedness and working with national level partners as well as provincial level partners on really understanding the complexity of gender and protection issues and how they come to the fore in an emergency. And it's just so critical because there are issues like, you know, land tenure that are very complex and deep, but really are critical in that moment of an emergency. And all stakeholders and governments and development partners and humanitarian partners need to be prepared to deal with that complexity in that rush of an emergency. So thank you for the comment.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. Have we got any further questions? It's running down towards the end of the day. So if we have no further takers to ask questions, we've got a great panel here. I'll take this opportunity to say thank you to the panellists for what was some really interesting presentations on research that's recently completed and ongoing. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'll hand over to Prince for some housekeeping after we've given the panellists another round of thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma and all the panelists. Okay, so just one thing before you go home tonight. We're handing out this this pink evaluation forms. If you're a bit too tired to answer, just answer number 1 and that would be okay for us. If you're sure that you'll come back tomorrow, and we hopefully you will come back tomorrow, you can do this tomorrow. But if not, you think you're not sure whether you can come back tomorrow, just please answer this and hand it over to any of the student volunteers. And I think for that, we're hope to see you tomorrow morning. We're starting again at 8:30 for the registration. Thank you.